I don't think there was anybody else like him in my lifetime. And before that, writers were not allowed such a wide range of activity as he managed to encompass.
I think he was great because he tackled everything that came into his ken. He invented a verbal form with which to tackle it, and simply because of his energy.
What seemed to me to be extraordinary about Anthony is that the whole body of work represents the man, and that to say, you know, Earthly Powers is the masterpiece or the Enderby trilogy is what he'll be remembered by, is in a way to ignore this prodigious fecundity and this prodigious invention that never seemed to dry out. I mean, one was in awe of it.
I think it's a disease. I'm not proud of it, but the impulse to write has become overriding and prevents my doing anything else. I mean, I don't play golf. I think I should be playing golf. I should be thinking of buying a small yacht. I don't know. Other people do these things and enjoy them, but the urge to work has become very much a habit. On the other hand, I would say this, that it becomes easier than many outsiders think. If you say to yourself, right, I'm going to produce 1,000 words a day, 365 days of the year, of course you will produce, I think, probably about half of War and Peace in a single year. You can write 1,000 words a day of the book you're currently working on, and then have a great deal of spare time left, in which time you want to do something else. I write music, but which is a kind of knitting for me. I put the score on my knee and watch the television and write my scores.
Anthony Burgess remains little known as a composer, but is widely recognized as one of the most extraordinary writers of the 20th century. He was the author of over 50 books and was as remarkable for the range of his interests as for his sheer productivity. A late starter in the art of fiction, he wrote in almost every genre, including social satire, science fiction, spy novels, and historical epics.
One of the extraordinary things about Burgess is that he'll write a novel about the Roman Empire, or he'll write a novel about Shakespeare, or he'll write a novel about the death of Marlowe, or he'll write a novel about Mozart, or he'll write a novel about Keats. He just looks around the world and thinks, I can get a novel out of that. He doesn't regard the contemporary world as the right, proper, and only subject matter.
Throughout his work, Burgess would return again and again to three obsessions: language, music, and the conflict of good and evil, a preoccupation which had its roots in the Catholic faith he had abandoned as a young man.
I was brought up a Catholic, and I remember writing a book that became undeservedly popular. They made a film out of it called A Clockwork Orange. I didn't know why I was writing it, but when I'd written it, I saw why I was writing it. It was because I was concerned with presenting a theme which was very much part of my background. It's a theme of the man's free will, the existence of good and evil, the necessity to choose between the two, because if we are creatures of choice, we must have two things to choose between. And this, I think, I see now has become a fairly consistent theme in my writing.
Burgess became exasperated by his constant association with A Clockwork Orange, a work he often dismissed as minor. It was the only one of his novels to be made into a film, directed by Stanley Kubrick in 1971. The novel was partly inspired by the juvenile delinquency of the late 50s and early 60s. Set in a Britain of the future, both book and film are narrated by the Beethoven-loving hero Alex, the leader of a gang of teenage thugs who beat, rape, and murder.
I had to write about real youths, real kids who were knocking each other about, and I tried to write it in the slang of the time, but I realized that By the time the book was published, if it ever got published, the slang would already be out of date, so I had to invent a slang. And if you invent a slang, of course, it has no chance of becoming out of date because it doesn't really exist.
What's it going to be then, eh? There was me, that is Alex, and my three droogs, that is Pete, Georgie and Dim. Dim being really dim. And we sat in the Corova milk bar and making up our russadocs what to do with the evening. Our pockets were full of deng, so there was no real need from the point of view of crasting any more Pretty Polly to toll-chop some old veck in an alley and video him swim in his blood while we counted the take-ins and divided by 4.
The language in which Alex tells his story is called Nadsat, an imaginary teenage dialect devised by Burgess from his studies of Russian.
To be honest with you, I struggled a bit through Clockwork Orange. I think it was, you know, having to thumb back to the dictionary in the end, the glossary or whatever, and you know, I couldn't really understand what the hell it was about. But on the second reading, I could tell that it was a very major piece of work, and on the third reading, I was absolutely blown away by it and thought it was one of the most remarkable pieces of work I'd read.
Kubrick's film exploited to the full Alex's exotic language and his adoration of classical music.
And it was like, for a moment, oh my brothers, some great bird had flown into the milk bar, and I felt all the melanky little hairs on my plot standing endwise, and the shivers crawling up like slow melanky lizards, and then down again, because I knew what she sang. It was a bit from the Glorious Ninth by Ludwig van.
It is a novel which wants to know why people commit gratuitous acts of evil. It gets quite a long way towards understanding it, and he then has the guts to defend his free will.
There was talk already at that time, going back 20-odd years, about the possibility of curing violence by taking over these young hooligans, these young thugs, and subjecting them to a psychological process of conditioning which would make them good. And that's what I show in the book, and indeed that's what's shown in the film.
When it came to the 6th or 7th Malchik, leering and smecking, and then going into it, I began to feel really sick. But I could not shut me glasses. And even if I tried to move my glass balls about, I still could not get out of the line of fire of this picture.
Get me out. I want to be sick. Get something for me to be sick in.
Very soon now, the drug will cause the subject to experience a death-like paralysis, together with deep feelings of terror and helplessness. One of our early test subjects described it as being like death, a sense of stifling or drowning. And it is during this period we have found that the subject will make his most rewarding associations between his catastrophic experience environment and the violence he sees.
Leave me glasses!
I remember when it opened, the film, there were editorials from the sort of liberals, you know, about, because they couldn't help kind of like the character, but there he was, raping and beating and God knows what else. And you end up feeling sorry for him. Because you only end up feeling sorry for him because the bigger issue is the right to choose. And to choose, even though he's bad, let him be bad, rather than alter his brain and make him into an automaton.
The theological dimension of Burgess's novel was largely lost in ferocious arguments over the film's apparent glamorization of violence.
I became associated with violence chiefly because of the film, and if a couple of nuns were raped in Berwick-on-Tweed, I would always get a telephone call from a newspaper, you know, Mr. Burgess, what do you think of this? Do you not feel in some measure responsible? Stanley, they would never telephone you, Stanley, because you keep out of the way. And I've had to deal with this all over the world.
Yes.
So in consequence, they've turned me into a kind of expert on violence, which I really know nothing about.
Burgess made comedy of his unwanted notoriety in his 1974 novel, The Clockwork Testament.
Oh, Mr. Enderby?
Professor Enderby speaking.
Oh, hi. This is the Spur Lansing Show. We wondered if you,
What? Who? What is this?
The Spur Lansing Show? Talk show? Television? The talk show?
Oh.
It's the movie, The Deutschland?
But I only wrote the... I mean, it was only my idea. They've been attacking it, have they?
No, some boys have been attacking some nuns in Manhattanville. I'm shocked you didn't know. I assumed...
nuns are always being attacked. Their purity is an affront to the dirty world.
Oh, remember that. Remember to say that. But the point is that they said they wouldn't have done it if they hadn't seen the movie. That's why we're...
I see. Always blame art, eh? Not original sin, but art. You ignore art as so much unnecessary garbage, or you blame it for your own crimes. That's the way of it. I'll get the bastards, all of them. I'm not having this sort of nonsense, do you hear? There was silence at the other end. You never take art for what it is. Beauty, ultimate meaning, form for its own sake, self-subsisting. Oh, no. It's always got to be either sneered at or attacked as evil. I'll have my bloody say. What's the name of the show again? But she'd rung off. Silly bitch.
My next guest lives in Monte Carlo. He speaks 7 languages, 8 if you include English, 10 if you include the languages he created for the films Clockwork Orange and The Quest for Fire. The phrase makers have called my final guest our most prolific polymath. First volume of his autobiography, Little Wilson and Big God, is published this week in paperback. A young musical prodigy, a prolific and successful author, a journalist, a critic, a linguist, a reviewer, screenwriter, now a playwright, and someone I'm delighted to welcome to Wogan, Anthony Burgess.
I never heard him complain about the publicity round he had to do for his books, and that publicity round became more and more demanding as people realized that he was good value. But I think that in his television, radio, and other appearances, as in his books, being a showman was part of what he really enjoyed.
The only exercise I ever take is just tapping away at a typewriter, except for sexual exercise. That's allowed. Indeed, I had a friend who's...
It's not good for you, though.
Sexual exercise, excellent.
Is it good for you?
First class.
Oh, I gave it up. What do you know about it?
Well, I had a friend with a slight heart condition, and his doctor said, well, sexual exercise is all right, as long as it's not too exciting, so do it with your wife and nobody else. Which was a bit of an insult to the wife.
There was something very unbuttoned and bawdy and open about him. I remember one time when he was complaining about how impossible it was to sell books, how people were much more interested in manuscripts than in books. And he was laughing about how he liked to put coffee stains on the manuscript and a bit of semen and this and that so as to make them more valuable to collectors.
Mine's all right, I think.
Yes, it sounds pretty good to me.
Oh, thank you.
He's sexually obsessed, certainly, but...
Well, I mean, that's part of our Catholic training, but...
Certainly not. Look, if you look back on your early life, which you have certainly written and so colourfully... I mean, it was all true.
It's all true. One doesn't lie. I'm telling the truth totally. The trouble, I think, with writing your own memoirs or autobiography is you want to please the reader. You don't want to bore the reader, and so you tend to miss out the bits that are dull. So if you read my book, you'll find that it's exciting. It's all sex, nothing else.
Yeah.
The things that happen between the sexual bouts are just not mentioned. You don't recall.
I think the autobiographies are tremendous books. I mean, maybe they should be classified as works of fiction because it's so much Anthony taking his life and shaping it. He's a great cover-up of tracks and traces, Anthony. I mean, there are very few photographs of him before, I don't know, the mid-60s, and he claimed they'd all been eaten by termites in Malaya or something like that, but I suspect there was something more guileful and covert going on.
Anthony Burgess was a pseudonym of John Burgess Wilson, born to a working-class Catholic family in Manchester in 1917. Anthony was his confirmation name, Burgess the maiden name of his mother.
Oh, Bertie,
Although she was a minor music hall star, known as the beautiful Belle Burgess, no photographs of her appear to have survived, and her son had no direct memory of her.
At the end of the First World War, in 1918, the influenza epidemic ravaged Europe, and in 1 week my mother and my sister died. Indeed, my father came home from his barracks in Preston to find both my mother and my sister lying dead on the bed, on their respective beds, while I was gurgling in my cradle. I was obviously destined for something, God knows what, but for something.
In the psychiatrist's chair, Anthony Burgess talks to Dr. Anthony Clare.
The earliest years, as you know, they're the ones that fascinate people like me. In your case, as you well know, they are dramatic in the sense that you were motherless from 18 months.
Yes, I've often wondered how important this is, because when I began to read Freud, Freud laid so much emphasis on the relationship of the child with the mother. Indeed, he set up this whole highly dramatic, well, this Greek tragedy, in effect, the Oedipus complex, the war with the father and so on. I don't think this could have happened in my own life, because I never had a mother substitute, and my relations with my father were rather lukewarm, and I had to grow up without something which I rather envied most other people. You know, the mother, the home atmosphere. I wonder whether this does anything to one in adult life, whether one becomes colder or less able to give affection, or you need to take affection, because one never had this early filial experience. I think I've said in the...
It didn't sound as if it was a very warm early childhood. Let's put it that way. Rationally, he was a bright little boy, and therefore it had less, perhaps, effect on him than otherwise. But he did seem to have a lot of difficulty with his feelings, being comfortable with himself. I mean, expressing positive and indeed negative feelings. Some of them are rather inchoate. He talks of rage and lust. He has difficulties talking about affection and love.
You have suspected yourself of a coldness.
I felt that I was always frightened of giving myself. I was always frightened of declaring love, and frightened of friendship, frightened of saying, you know, you are my friend, I like you, I love you. Because I had no cushion, as it were, no infantile cushion to which I could refer when I entered into an emotional relationship. I think the situation now is that I have no friends. I suddenly wake up to the realization that I know nobody really, except my wife, and that possibly this small civilization of marriage is enough. That is not quite normal, I think.
Princess Road, in the Moss Side area of Manchester, was just one of various addresses where the young John Burgess Wilson grew up in the 1920s. His father remarried and inflicted on him a stepmother he strongly disliked. While she ran a tobacconist's shop, the father spent most of his life in pubs, for business as well as for pleasure.
My poor father used to play the piano in a pub. He also played in the old silent cinema, you know, and the kind of piano he had was rather like this. He never prepared his music beforehand. He always made it up as he went along, and he never saw the film he accompanied before the performance. So it was rather like this, you know, he'd be looking up at the screen and he'd be playing. But in a pub, it was pretty much the same. He used to play...
What kind of music did he play there? Popular songs?
Popular songs of the day, but, you know, songs that were sort of traditional.
And did he have to sing as well?
He did sing rather badly, as I sing, something like this, you know. The song at twilight, when the lights are low, and the whispering shadows softly come and go. Though the heart be weary, sad the day and long, still towards the twilight comes love's old song, comes love's old sweet. Badly, sung badly, but that's what they wanted.
At the age of 11, John Burgess Wilson won a scholarship to Xaverian College, a secondary school run by Jesuit priests. He made a return visit to the school in 1980 for Granada Television.
I remember my childhood was a matter of being frightened of hellfire, frightened of sex, frightened of sensuality generally, and this fear of life was, of course, perhaps appropriate to the climate. In my early days, up to the age of about 14, I daren't walk through the streets looking with pleasure, say, at girls who passed. To look at a girl was to lust after her, or so we were told. The great thing was to get to heaven if you could. And of course, Manchester helped. The weather always helped. The hard work always helped. The lack of colour and gaiety always helped. Get this life over as quickly as you could and get through, if you could, possibly, with a pass degree, not with a high-flying honours degree, into the next world. Say, thank God I've made it. Coming back into this room, which has not changed in, oh heavens, nearly 50 years, of course, I've become a schoolboy again, until I see myself in this mirror, see the changes. This was the room of punishment, and one came in here to be hit for infractions of the law. Here I was brought to argue, or rather to submit to my headmaster on the question of my own apostasy, my own leaving the church.
When Burgess cast off Catholicism, he wanted to cast off the whole idea that you could be predestined to be saved or to be damned. And St. Augustine said that what mattered was your faith, that you were either saved because you believed in God or you were damned because in some curious way you had not accepted the church.
The Irish novelist James Joyce wrote only 4 major books, but perhaps uniquely for a great writer, all are accepted as masterpieces. Here, in the monitor cutting room, is the novelist Anthony Burgess, who wrote tonight's Joyce programme, working on the film, which was all shot in Dublin.
One of the great difficulties that I'm finding, looking at this film after, well, more than 30 years since we made it, is that it's difficult to disentangle the two writers in a curious sort of way, Joyce and Burgess. And I guess this is because Burgess did have this tremendous feeling of kinship for the whole undertow of Catholicism and exile and cunning.
He was a renegade. I myself, at the age of 16, was a renegade. He'd made his world out of the materials from the world he'd rejected. I wanted confirmation that the agonies and elation I knew as a renegade had some sort of artistic significance, meant something. I should imagine that when an Anglican loses his faith, it's a smooth and sweet process, rather like the shedding of a skin. His church has as good as told him not to take its doctrines too seriously.
No business to say that, of course, but one forgives him.
But for a cradle Catholic, to leave his church is like the wrenching of palpable bone and muscle. It's like the draining of the very contents of the skull.
Bit over the top, that shot.
To me, at an age when I could neither accept nor answer the arguments of the Holy Name Jesuits, it was unavoidable agony, because it seemed to be happening totally against my will. Anyway, it seemed to me that what I called reason was tugging one way, and emotion, instinct, loyalty, and fear were tugging the other. James Joyce summed it all up for me in A Portrait of the Artist.
Hell. Hell is a strait and dark and foul-smelling prison, an abode of demons and lost souls, filled with fire and smoke. The straitness of this prison house is expressly designed by God to punish those who refuse to be bound by his laws. In hell, all laws are overturned. There is no thought of family or country, of ties or relationships. The damned howl and scream at one another, their torture and rage intensified by the presence of beings tortured and raging like themselves. All sense of humanity is forgotten. The yells of the suffering sinners fill the remotest corners of the vast abyss.
Some would say that hell is loneliness, wouldn't they? Absolute isolation. And I think that although he lived a married life, there was a terrible, terrible solitariness that gnawed and tugged at him for an awfully long time, all the time I knew him anyway.
Burgess was interested in all the arts as a boy. He won a prize for drawing. He didn't do much painting because of his color blindness, but he was interested in words, he wrote poetry, but it seemed that his greatest love was for music.
I was brought up in a very large Manchester pub with 3 singing rooms, they used to call them, 3 pianos going all the time. I first had cacophony when I was a very small child, upstairs, trying to sleep, listening to 3 pianos. But also the fact was that Manchester, Blackpool, the north in general, is a curious sort of place where music plays, I think, a larger part in life than it does in the south. And living in Manchester again with an internationally known orchestra like the Halley meant that I was drawn in that direction. Literature came very belatedly indeed, and it probably came through music. I remember the incredible shock, pleasurable shock I had when I was a young boy. I'd made myself a crystal set. Pure. And I remember hearing Debussy's L'après-midi d'un faune, being entranced by the wealth of color, the subtlety of the color, and I must do something like that. This is filling in the gap that has been left by not being able to appreciate genuine color.
He began teaching himself. He describes himself as an autodidact, and there's a line, he says, "Find middle C and you have found everything." And that's how he describes having taught himself to play the piano. One can only believe this remarkable story. He wanted to study music at the university. He found that he couldn't because he hadn't had a course in physics that was a requirement. So he ended up studying English literature instead, but did a lot of composing. After university, he was a music director in the Army, and he wrote many pieces for dance band and jazz band, all kinds of arrangements. And still it seems that his dream was always to become a composer.
At Manchester University, Burgess, the frustrated composer, immersed himself in literature. He also began to study phonetics and linguistics, which were to become a lifetime's fascination. Many years later, these studies helped him to create a language for Jean-Jacques Annaud's film Quest for Fire, an imaginative recreation of man's struggle towards civilization.
All we know is that our ancestors were not doing, say, what the Zulus did. They weren't using clicks like that. They weren't using that kind of noise. They weren't doing what the Chinese do. They weren't using a tonal language. Mi-on-aha. They weren't doing that. They were using a language with heavy stresses. Bang, bang, bang. Fratro, fratro. And they were using languages with a lot of endings, you know, as in Latin. Mensa, mensa, mensae, mensaro, mensis, mensis. We're doing that sort of thing. And the sounds they were using were pretty well the sounds we have. So we can construct a language for these people 50,000 years ago, but we have to use a lot of guesswork.
No, bring up! No! No!
We had regular sessions, you know, where we were going through my list of words that I needed, and we would pick either the Latin root or the Saxon root or the Germanic root.
Ulam! Ulam!
And we devised a very, very complex language with all the grammar. And I must say that all my crew, and of course my actors and myself, we could communicate in that language. And we were fluent in this language that we called Ulam. And we had a very interesting session with Desmond Morris, who was my consultant for body language, you know. That I still remember from those days.
Bye. Bye. No, what is it? Sorry. Bye. 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 Bye.
Bye. Guy, let's go. Guy. Guy. Guy.
Guy.
Guy.
Guy. Guy. Guy.
I am hungry for tiger meat. There, you can build a big structure. I am hungry for tiger meat. Saye esachau vau satirstria, or sir esachau tirstria. I am hungry for tiger meat. Esachau vau, saye esachau vau satirstria.
He liked repeating the words to relish them. You know, like people would taste a wine, little sip, and then taste it in the mouth. So he had this pleasure with language. I remember him as a large voice saying, "Atra, atra, atra." Yes, it's good. It's good. It's the fireplace in your language. In your language, so well. Maybe it's good to use more Saxon roots. No, Latin and Greek is better. So we had a lot of those roots, of course, in our language.
Yekta. What? Algo. Yeka. No. Nos. Atro. Sis. Naka atra.
The movie was quite a success, especially in New York. And they interviewed people after the movie, and they said, "Who is the director, do you think?" And everybody came up with Anthony Burgess. I was very flattered.
Young men who will undergo military training for 6 months of their 21st year come forward to fill up their forms. Inside labour exchanges throughout the country...
With the outbreak of war, Burgess was conscripted into the British Army, and in 1943, he was posted to Gibraltar.
For you, as for so many, the war, your experience in that war, was...
It was crucial. It was crucial, not because of any privations. I'm lucky I survived. Some of my friends didn't. But I think what we began to feel in that war was how powerful the division was in England between the upper and the lower classes, how despised the working class was, and the lower middle class, the shopkeeping class, which was mine, and how little our governors understood us. I was a sergeant, and a sergeant major. In other words, I was in the ranks. And I felt toward the officers who gave me orders a great deal of contempt. If there's a question of taking sides, I'm on the side of the working class, because that's the class I come from. And, of course, the working class can be associated in my mind with Irish labourers who are Catholic, Soho waiters who are Catholic, and indeed a religion which is working class, more than aristocratic.
I see you've all got the idea.
Burgess's task of teaching The British Way and Purpose, the Army's mission to explain the prospects of the post-war world, would later feature in the first novel he wrote, A Vision of Battlements.
He walked on, greeted by various grinning troops. It comforted him to think that there was something like affection in these greetings. It was affection won by a kind of hypocrisy, for in most of his talks to the units, he deliberately made himself a mere mouthpiece for the inchoate feelings of the many inarticulate. The talks were called bolshe, delightful old-fashioned word, but they were not really political. He invoked a vague golden age to come. They all, speaker and audience, knew it would never come, when wrongs would be righted, wives no longer seduced by the stranger in the land, Pole, Free French, American, work plentiful and beer cheap. It was all an opiate, but perhaps even a kind of poetry in which the act of expression meant everything, the content nothing. And so perhaps we can look forward to an age when real equality will be possible, when we workers will no longer be spat upon, spurned like so much offal, when the mighty will be brought low and the humble raised, democracy a reality, no longer a pious shibboleth. Such perorations often gained applause, sometimes cheers. The troops merely needed a voice, their repressions and grievances, the catharsis of a bard's utterance. Nobody really believed that the new city would ever be built.
While a student, Burgess had met Llywela Isherwood Jones, generally known as Lynn, who became his first wife.
My first wife was Protestant Welsh. The Welsh, I think, on the whole, are more sexually given than other Celts. I mean, the Irish drink, the Scots drink. They're not a very sexually minded race, either of them. The Welsh are given to that. My first wife honestly believed that free, indiscriminate sexual congress was not a bad thing, because this prevented one from identifying with love. She said love was a different thing altogether. She may have been right, but as we know, when we see, then the knife comes out. We can't so easily overcome our primitive instincts.
I wish I'd ever known what made Lynn tick, or for that matter, why they got married, except that perhaps they needed to, as it were, be a hone and a knife, just sharpen each other, or suffer from each other, or something.
After the war, Burgess became a lecturer in speech and drama at a northern training college. He failed once again to study music formally and became an English teacher at Banbury Grammar School.
I think that he was probably a very stimulating teacher. And I know that people who were taught by him in the sixth form found him very, really a very good teacher.
He always wore his academic gown. It was always flying behind him. He was rather slim, quite tall, very, very busy physically. And he impressed us all, I think. In this small group, there were just 6 or 7 of us doing A-levels. I very strongly remember working on poets like Donne and Marvell and George Herbert. And looking back now, I think those were the most impressive lessons. Of course, we did Shakespeare with him, set books and so on. But we did these metaphysical poets, which none of us had ever read any of this material before. And looking back, there is, of course, the fascination with language, that he loved to to use early Elizabethan and early English language in speech. He liked to read poems to us in the original pronunciation.
No, I am alone. Oh, what a roar the peasants slain am I.
He had a rich, rather lovely voice, and he quite liked using it.
In a brave of passion, would force his soul so to his own conceit, that from her working all the visage wan, tears in his eyes, distraction in his aspect, a broken voice, and his own function.
Burgess, still known as John Wilson, lived with Lynn in the nearby village of Adderbury, in a small cottage they named Little Gidding. Adderbury had a thriving tradition of amateur dramatics, in which he played an enthusiastic part.
This is where we held our plays, and we did our play reading. And there's the piano that John Wilson used to play. If, after the play reading, he was in a good mood, he would play jazz. But if he wasn't very pleased, he would play classical music. It was a village activity, and our second production was Juno and the Haycock, an Irish comedy. And John Wilson, alias Anthony Burgess, was our producer.
We were so few in numbers that he sort of had to take part. We didn't have enough members to cover the cast.
And his wife.
And his wife took a small
Lynn
part
as well. He was different to local village people. He liked to drink and frequent the Red Lion and the Bell.
He wasn't what the older members of the village expected.
I think his views were different. They often had arguments in the pubs, you know.
Yes, yes. He would be quite forceful in his views.
Yes, he had different views to the locals, you know.
Banbury Grammar School had an extremely good dramatic society for old pupils, OBDS, Old Bamburians Dramatic Society. And when John Wilson was there, he produced, I think it was four or five plays. Well, this was the Chiltern Hundreds that he produced. I remember I played this old man, and it was my 21st birthday on the last night of the play. This was the thing by J.S. Eliot, that Sweeney Agonistes, and I hadn't a clue what was on most of the time. I remember birth, copulation and death. But he wrote the music to this, under the bamboo, under the bamboo, under the bamboo tree. I can still remember most of the words, but it was a bit above me, though.
Under the bamboo, 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 under the bamboo tree. Two livers one, one livers two, two livers three. Under the under the boo, under the bamboo tree.
He did Aldous Huxley, The Gioconda Smile. This is from the Oxford Mail in 1951. John Wilson is still obtaining remarkably good results from youthful material and is to be congratulated on another first-rate production. It was said that he quite often wrote his own reviews. He certainly wrote one of the reviews of his own books. After rehearsals, we had a lot of fun because we'd always go down to the local pub and he drank vast quantities of rough cider and never spirits and never beer. He'd get into the car, which was an open two-seater car, and as I took him back to his house in Adderbury, he would stand up, holding onto the screen, and shout into the wind passages of Chaucer, Elizabethan English.
A broken voice and his old functions.
He came up with all sorts of reasons why it was necessary to do it. Everybody should shout into the wind.
What's heck of it to him, or he to heck of it, that he should wait for her?
Several years after leaving Banbury Grammar School, Burgess published The Worm and the Ring, a novel closely based on his experiences as a teacher.
It's set in the school, which is quite clearly Banbury Grammar School. Some of the children are very well drawn, rather yobbish, And there's a trip to Paris, and the master called Christopher Howarth, who is clearly John Wilson or Burgess. There's another one who is, some people have identified as me, and they take a group of children to Paris, and they behave very badly. One of the children's knocked down, and he gets terribly drunk, and they have an affair. So I did actually go to Paris on a trip, but my husband came with me. So it was this rather dangerous mixture of fact and fiction. But was it safer to court Hilda Connor? Indiscreet, also double adultery. He saw her sturdy legs in hockey dress. Come on, girls. Yet he had smelt Schiaparelli's shocking on her, having first seen the vial in her handbag, and had admired the slim, blood-tipped fingers that gripped a vicious marking pencil. Her eyes had been warm lately. Her husband was away, a major of engineers, and she kept house with her mother, waiting for leaves and weekends. Her home in the village on the other side of the town was antipodal to his own. The name of the village, Rodforth, crackled in his mind, crepitated like silk underclothes. She would be marking maths books now, her body fallow. Did the coming of spring simmer in her? He turned back, sighing out smoke, to his task. It's so naughty, it's so full of half-truths, fictionalized, fantasy. It's so obviously a person, but it's just not correct. Though I did play hockey.
The school's former secretary, Gwen Bustin, also felt she'd been misrepresented by the novel. She took legal action, and Heinemann withdrew the book and had it pulped.
That was really quite an eye-opener, and a frightful scandal, of course, because they certainly didn't think that school secretaries were particularly involved with members of staff. So a lot of the suggestions in that book and the mention of sort of love affairs going on came to us as quite a shock, and we were inclined to disbelieve what were obviously the comparisons made with the staff in the grammar school.
I'm quite sure he was wrong about all of that stuff in The Worm and the Ring. Quite convinced. I knew all of the people he referred to, the young English mistresses and history mistresses, whatever. And I think this was a fantasy, perhaps one he would like to have seen, but I'm sure it wasn't. It was his fantasy, wasn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, I think we all thought that. But then underneath, you know, who knows?
He wrote letters and poems to me. He used to put them on the staff notice board, unsealed, with my name on the front. So everyone knew he wrote the letters and the poems, but that's all they knew.
In the summer of 1954, Burgess took up a teaching post in Kuala Kangsar in Malaya. He returned there in 1981 for the BBC series Writers and Places to reflect on this period in his life.
This is the place where I taught, the Malay College in the town of Kuala Kangsar. It was founded in 1905 as a kind of British public school for the sons of Malay sultans and rajas and chiefs. The Eton of the East, it was called. Soon, the college was democratized. The son of a paddy planter or fisherman or village medicine man was welcome so long as he was bright and earnest enough. The college still flourishes, but the British who built it have gone. Now, Malay teachers teach Malay boys in Malay, not English. But here is one British teacher who has come back, though only for a visit.
Kala. If. If. How do you say it? If. Again? If. How do you say it?
If.
Again?
If.
Again?
If.
Is that right?
Is that right? Yes. Is that good?
Yes.
We are very lazy people in England. We are very lazy people, and when we pronounce our words, we do it rather like this. If you go up, we don't say, if you go up river, which is rather it's as though you're standing to attention. If you go up river, too strong. We are very slack. If you go up river.
Following his post in Kuala Kangsar, Burgess went north to Kota Baru, where he now began to train teachers.
He made friends and tried to develop an insight into the people of Malaya. That made him different because the people that he was teaching with, my colleagues and his colleagues, we really kept to a European social scene. There was a European club. John Wilson joined the multiracial club in the town.
I came here as a teacher, but I left as a writer. I used to sit in Kadais like this when my schoolwork was finished and sketch my first novel. I called it Time for a Tiger, borrowing the slogan of the beer I drank while I scribbled. Why this urge to record Malaya in fiction? Surely it had been done before, and very adequately, by William Somerset Maugham. True enough, but it was very much an outsider's Malaya, the planters and their wives, bridge in the club and adultery in the district officer's bungalow. The Chinese and the Indians were very shadowy figures, and the Malays were reduced to a pair of obsequious brown feet on the veranda. However inadequate my own literary equipment might be, at least I got to know the people. Indeed, I got to know the Malays rather better than Joseph Conrad. I taught their sons. I spoke their language.
Time for a Tiger is the first of 3 novels published under the pseudonym of Anthony Burgess, which became known as the Malayan Trilogy. The central character is an English teacher called Victor Crabbe, who, like Burgess, is at odds with his wife Fenella as he witnesses the last days of British colonial rule.
Crabbe thought, I should want to go home, like Fenella. I should be so tired of the shambles here, the obscurantism, the colour prejudice, the laziness and ignorance, as to desire nothing better than a headship in a cold stone country school in England. But I love this country. I feel protective towards it. Sometimes, just before dawn breaks, I feel that I somehow enclose it, contain it. I feel that it needs me. This is absurd, because snakes and scorpions are ready to bite me, a drunken Tamil is prepared to knife me, the Chinese in the town would like to spit at me, someday a Malay boy will run amok and try to tear me apart. But it doesn't matter. I want to live here. I want to be wanted. Despite the sweat, the fever, the prickly heat, the mosquitoes, the terrorists, the fools at the bar of the club, despite Fenella.
The Malayan Trilogy is very much a picture of the scene that we knew. I know of a number of instances from the book that are certainly drawn from real life, and I would say yes, it was an authentic picture of Malaya as I knew it in 1955.
I think the Malayan Trilogy, as a picture of hopeless, colonial life, it's devastatingly good, I think. It's completely ruthless and merciless about what, British imperialism, the fag end of it, does to people. And it's got a horrific picture of alcoholism in it, which is, I think, as good as anything, apart from Lowry, any 20th century writer's ever done.
Alcohol was already playing a large part in the Burgesses' lives, bringing them into disrepute with their fellow expatriates.
As a colleague of his, I never saw John misbehave one little bit. But our community in the Teachers' College was very small and gossip was rife. So we had the impression of John Wilson and his wife that they were both rather scandalous characters who got drunk and did outrageous things. I was in their house once at the college, And it had been John's responsibility to buy the meat for the evening meal. And Lynn said, "How many steaks did you get?" And he said, I got 2. He said, 2? There's 3 of us, you big ape. That was the sort of type of person that I thought she was. She was, if you like, crude.
With his Malayan contract at an end, Burgess took up another teaching post in the East, this time in Brunei.
When I was there, it was evident that it was going to be a very rich state because of the massive oil deposits which were being developed and exploited. But I found the life there very frustrating, chiefly because the Malay subjects of the Sultan were aware that they did not have to work. The money was coming in from oil. They didn't have to learn. I was trying to teach them, and they didn't want to be taught. And there were other elements of frustration. My first wife was drinking heavily and making a nuisance of herself. We were always being picked up by the police and so on. And one day in the classroom I decided that I had enough, let others take over. I just lay down on the floor with a kind of interest, see what would happen. Then I was picked up and shoved into the local hospital. And various elementary tests were given, and then I was thrown home. And then eventually my wife was told there is evidence of a cerebral tumour, but it is inoperable, and I don't know whether this is common, but she told me that they gave me a year to live. But I suddenly decided I didn't.
One possibility is that he was drinking heavily out in Brunei. He'd had a couple of fits, and in the medical situation that they had there, maybe he looked awful. There were 1 or 2 other neurological signs, and they put it down erroneously to a tumour. It happens in, or did then, in even more sophisticated societies than Brunei. So it's possible. And then when he came back here and they ran a few tests, they found it wasn't. If he's half the man we suspect he is, it was a God-given drama.
I didn't feel too bad about it. I felt it was not true. In any case, I'd been given a year. I've not been given a year since.
But you sat down and you didn't just reach for the bottle. You sat down and started to write.
I sat down with a sense of duty to my prospective widow and tried to make little money. It was very difficult. You could never make much money with writing, to fulfill what talent I had and produce the works I did.
Burgess, now aged 42, moved to the south coast town of Hove, where he managed to produce 5.5 novels in a single year. The fatal diagnosis proved false, and the threatened death of John Wilson proved to be the making of the writer known as Anthony Burgess.
And the Burgess Variations concludes tomorrow night at 8 o'clock.